Hello, girls and boys. It's story time. My name is T. Turner, and I'm going to read Meeting Trees, which is written by Scott Russell Sanders with illustrations by Robert Hines. This book is dedicated to Robin Ray Sanders. It's a story about his uncle and his grandfather. One summer day, my father and I were in the workshop making a stool for my grandmother. I measured the walnut board, my father sawed it, and both of us fitted the pieces together. We had to wait for the glue to dry before we could rub the stool with oil. So my father cocked an eyebrow at me and said, "Scott, you reckon the trees are lonesome?" I stared through the open door at the woods behind our house. "They look mighty lonesome to me," I answered. "Then lace up your boots," my father said, "and let's walk." Boots laced up, we hiked through the garden where butterflies were flitting, then by the pasture, where ponies were munching grass, then past the barn, where owls and bats would be sleeping and mice would be scurrying in the hay. I looked closely at the swallowtail butterfly on the dogwood leaf. Beyond the barn, we entered the shadowy woods. Here and there, light broke through where a tree had fallen and let in the sun. As we passed through one patch of light, I looked up at my father and said, "You've got sawdust in your hair." "That's what makes it curly," he said, raking fingers through his wavy red hair. My father often smelled of sawdust because he loved working in his shop. He made my bed and dresser and desk. He made tree houses and trucks. We never hurried in the woods. Trees don't rush about, my father liked to say, so why should we? We moseyed along, taking our own sweet time. We stopped to listen for birds twittering, squirrels chattering, and wind whooshing through the leaves. We paused to look at crayfish and minnows flickering in the creek. Squatting down, we studied ferns and flowers and moss, and we smelled the rich dirt. Can you see the red robin? It's on a ironwood branch. We stood for a spell watching a spider weave her web. Then my father asked, "Do you see any beech trees?" I glanced around until I spied a trunk with smooth gray bark like the skin of a hippo. "There's one," I said. "Right you are. Now how about a yellow poplar?" So here's the beech. And now I need to look at this beautiful agropy spider, black and yellow. Can you see it weaving its web? I squinted up until I saw pointy leaves shaped like tulips waving against the sky. "There!" My father grinned. "You've got sharp eyes, buddy." It was a game we played in the woods. My father named a tree, and I searched for the right kind of bark or branch or leaf. The tulips. See them? The pointy leaves. I knew that shagbark hickories are covered in stiff gray curls, as though someone had been whittling them. that tree. Pretty bark. White birches have papery bark, good for making canoes. The bark of sycamores is patchy as an old quilt down near the ground and creamy white up high. The bark of wild cherries looks as though it has been stitched with thread. Here's the wild cherry right here. From walking with my father, I knew that willow leaves are like feathers, and the leaves of redbuds are like valentine hearts, and sassafras has leaves like mittens. Willow. Redbud, see the heart, and sassafras. The needles of red pines come in pairs, and the needles of white pines come in bundles of 5. Sweet gum leaves look like zigzag stars, and the leaves of white oaks curve up and down like roller coasters. The red pine, the white pine. You see the roller coaster? That's kind of cool. I knew some trees by their seeds and fruits. In spring, maple seeds come spinning down like propellers, and elm seeds skitter down like confetti. Mulberry fruits come ripe in summer and turn your fingers purple when you pick them. Maple. And here's the mulberry fruits. In fall, squirrels nibble seeds from pine cones, birds eat red holly berries, and buckeye seeds turn shiny and brown like the eyes of deer, or like my father's eyes. Squirrels, birds, and the deer. Today in the woods, my father smiled at me with his shiny eyes and said, "I've got somebody I'd like you to meet." He led me to a great tree that rose up taller than a barn. Even holding hands, we could not reach around the fat trunk. I ran my fingers in the deep grooves of the bark. I pulled down a branch to study the leaflets all lined up on their twigs like cross ties on a railroad track. I plucked a green fruit the size of a lemon. The skin was bumpy and hard, and it left on my fingers the sharp, clean smell of soap. After I discovered everything I could about the tree, I asked my father, "Who is this?" "This is black walnut," he told me. Putting his arm across my shoulder, he said to the tree, "And this is my son, Scott." We walked back that way towards the house, my father's arm on my shoulder, until we came to our yard. There's his dad introducing him to the black walnut. Then I stopped beside my favorite tree, the red oak my father had planted from a sapling before I was born. He wanted me to have an oak for company, he told me, because trees make steady friends. Like me, the oak was young but growing fast. Already some of the limbs were as thick as my arms. "When's it going to be big enough for climbing?" I asked my father. The oak. He looked at the oak, then at me. "I'd say it's big enough today." "Really?" I cried. "Would you give me a lift?" So my father hoisted me up and settled me on the lowest limb. For a moment he kept hold of my waist. You can let go, I said. He gave me a squeeze, then took his hands away. I balanced there, my head a bit higher than my father's. From the sawdust in his hair, I breathed in the smell of wood.